Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if the US won the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is a very famous war in history. The Vietnam War didn't start out as a war of the US against Vietnam, but it is to be understood in the context of decolonization and the Cold War. The French already had a lot of trouble in keeping control in Indochina, and the US actually pushed France and also Britain to give their colonies their independence. Already during World War II and during the Japanese occupation, Ho Chi Minh, the future leader of Vietnam, he wanted a free Vietnam under communism, while the French, they backed Emperor Bao, who in OTL became the last emperor of the Nguyen dynasty. With the Geneva Accords, Vietnam became split with a communist north and a capitalist south. The south was very unstable, and Emperor Bao was quickly ousted by Ngo Dinh Diem in a referendum. This was something rather negative because Ngo Dinh Diem wasn't known to be the most moderate person. And of course, once you have oppression, a resistance is quickly formed. Duong Van Minh, the guy who made a coup against this newly elected Prime Minister Diem, he wasn't the most moderate person neither. South Vietnam was not really a democracy. The US assumed that the resistance against Ngo Dinh Diem was pro-communist and sponsored by North Vietnam. Kennedy, believing in the domino theory, started to increase US aid in Vietnam, and the presence of the troops in Vietnam, they increased from initially a few hundreds to a few thousands. Over the next couple of years and under the presidency of Johnson, more troops had been sent to Vietnam, and neutral countries such as Laos had been bombarded in order to stop the flow of the supplies coming from the communists, at least officially. By November 1967, the US had almost 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam, and they lost over 15,000 soldiers, and over 100,000 of them they were wounded. As the war went on, many soldiers, they started to mistrust the government and they claimed that the US would be winning the war. The anti-war movement within the US also grew, and as a result, there was pressure from the inside, which started to rise considerably. Horrific images being shown on the TV turned many US citizens against the war as well. The fact that the South, or South Vietnam, wasn't seen as a democratic but a corrupt state didn't really help the US cause. North Vietnam started some offensives in the 60s, and while they were not strong enough to kick off the US from Indochina, they could win some time until a strong majority was against the war. It is true that North Vietnam would not be able to win against the US on equal terms, but let's not forget the US was a democracy. The US wasted a huge amount of money in the war. The US fought on foreign soil and also disrespected the sovereignty of Cambodia and Laos and also Vietnam to some extent. They gave the communists in the north the advantage. And by 1976, Vietnam was completely unified. But what if all of that changed? What if the US won the Vietnam War? Let's just say that the US government would change their approach with the media and public relations in particular. The US would, for instance, try to censor certain images that would be shown on the TV normally in OTL. This would be censorship, and yes, it is something that we think dictatorships will use. But at the end of the day, even democracies have their own ways to censor stuff, be it on TV, radio, or online nowadays. So that would be very much in the realm of possibilities. And let's not forget that the US was anti-communist, and it could be interpreted as communist propaganda. Additionally, the US government could just become more ardent in their claim that they would win the war in Vietnam. Yes, more soldiers, they would die. The peace movement would grow larger and the war would drag on for a few more years. However, I believe that the US could eventually win with that strategy, tire down the communists, and a white peace could be reached with a huge demilitarized zone. In this war, I think that a peace treaty would be very possible, unlike the Korea War. Relations between North and South Vietnam would not be the best, of course, but both countries, they would eventually be able to talk things out. Kinda like Western and Eastern Germany, for instance. The US would then need to have a talk with Duong Van Minh, or by that time someone else could replace him already. South Vietnam would be forced by the US to undertake democratic reforms because one of the biggest criticism was that South Vietnam was a corrupt state. South Vietnam would not change immediately, but over the time, South Vietnam would become very democratic. A few other factors, they would also come in handy. The ethnic Chinese people in South Vietnam would have stayed, like in Malaysia for instance, or in Singapore, and they would not be leaving as boat people. Several thousands of smart, educated people, they would also still be there. A brain drain would occur most likely in the north of Vietnam, and they would be gladly be absorbed by the south. Yes, the US would also outsource a lot of factories to Vietnam, but would still outsource a lot of factories to China. I don't think that all of China would suddenly be ignored because the US would anyway just change their policies about China, and yeah, the Sino-Soviet split was still a thing. And even with the US winning the Vietnam War, this would not change at all. Singapore and the ASEAN would have become even more prosperous, because not only would South Vietnam get factories development and aid from the West, but they were very close to Singapore, which already functioned as an import-export hub. South Vietnam's population could grow a lot and rival the population of Thailand, which in this timeline could maybe see a little bit less of development. And let's also not forget that tourism would be more developed in South Vietnam, and thus Thailand would have a strong concurrent. The North would become more isolated than in OTL, but there would be no war against China. The North would still get support from the Soviet Union, and less Vietnamese people would immigrate to a socialist brother state. In general, Eastern Europe would almost get none of the Vietnamese immigrants it did in our timeline, because most of them, they would just escape to South Vietnam. How would the US change? While some alternate historians suggest that the US would intervene everywhere directly in the scenario of winning in Vietnam, I actually believe that due to the increasing popularity of the anti-war movement, these interventions, they would be less frequent and only clandestine. I don't think that the US would be completely isolationist, but the foreign policies, they would be adjusted somewhat. A lot of money had been gone, many more soldiers would die, and people would ask themselves, why would they just be fighting for other countries? They haven't even heard about such countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. What's that? And all that money would be wasted in foreign lands. And yet, bridges, streets, sidewalks, other infrastructure within the US is really looking bad. The impact on the US politics of such a thinking, yes, it would alter it for sure. But I cannot really tell how exactly it would be altered. Maybe down the line, isolationism could indeed become more popular. And once the generation of the anti-war movement gets more mature, we could see a less interventionist USA in the 90s or early 2000s. But once an intervention is seen as necessary, it would be done until the very end. North Vietnam would be isolated, and with the fall of communism, I could see the unification of both Vietnams happening under the leadership of the South. A united Vietnam would economically become a big force, and perhaps even become one of the most developed nations in Southeast Asia, or, well, even all of Asia. US bases, they would still be there, and with the US still having bases in there, their dominance in the South China Sea would also remain unbroken. China would have a harder time getting anything done in the South China Sea. And that's where we leave it for now.
That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.